My name is Elena Hartley, and I'm 30 years old. I didn't grow up rich, but I did grow up resourceful. My mother, Denise, raised me on her own after my father walked out when I was 5. She was fierce, unpredictable, and charming to everyone but me. While she worked multiple jobs and carried the title of survivor, there was always something transactional in her love. Every birthday gift had strings. Every compliment felt like currency. Still, she was my mom, and despite her flaws, I wanted her to be proud of me. Which is probably why, when I made my first real fortune, I went straight to her house. It wasn't luck that got me there. It was years of failed startups, late nights, cheap coffee, and one genius move: developing an AI-powered logistics algorithm that disrupted a stagnant industry. I sold my company at 29 for over $18 million, netting me around $10M after taxes and equity distributions. I was stunned. It wasn't just money, it was validation. And still, the first person I wanted to tell was Denise. Not my investors, not my friends, my mom. She was more shocked than proud when I handed her the news. "What are you going to do with all that money, Elena?" she asked, eyes narrowing like she'd been handed a test she didn't study for. I laughed and said, "I've got plans. But first, I need somewhere safe to keep it while I travel for a few weeks. Your place is off the radar. Think I could stash a few things in your basement safe?" She didn't hesitate. "Of course, baby. You trust your old mom more than a bank." That line hit me harder than it should have. I smiled anyway and told her I'd be back in 2 weeks. I made a show of carrying a small black case down into the old basement safe she kept tucked behind a false panel in her laundry room. The safe had belonged to my grandfather, a fireproof digital lock model with more bark than bite. Inside the black case, a stack of documents, decoy cash, and a small high-resolution camera hidden behind foam lining. I also placed a single envelope on top, labeled plainly, "For emergencies only, Mom." Then I spun the dial, locked it, and gave her a hug goodbye. You might be wondering why I didn't leave the real money in a bank, or why I trusted Denise after everything. The truth is, I didn't, not fully. This wasn't just about the money, it was a test, and if she failed it, well, I had planned for that too. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a security notification: motion detected, basement safe accessed. I checked the camera footage through the Secure Cloud app. There she was, Denise at 2:07 a.m., prying open the laundry panel and kneeling in front of the safe. She entered the code I'd given her, removed the case, and ran her fingers along the envelope before pulling it out. Then she shut the safe, didn't relock it, and walked upstairs. I watched every frame without blinking. By sunrise, her phone was off, her car was gone, so was the decoy case. No note, no explanation. No surprise, I didn't call the police. I didn't even text her, because I knew exactly where she was going. What Denise didn't know was that the case didn't contain the real money that was held in offshore accounts and diversified through crypto, bonds, and silent partnerships. What she took was a lesson, a trap really, one I had anticipated, because when you grow up with a mother like mine, you learn that love is conditional and loyalty is negotiable. By the 3rd day, I received a call from an unknown number in Mexico. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice came through, upbeat and breathy. "Hey, sweetie, I had to leave town really quickly, but I'll be back soon, okay? Hope everything's okay at home." I didn't respond. Instead, I sent a message to someone else. She took it, just like we thought. "You know what to do." Somewhere in a beach-front cafe in Puerto Vallarta, Denise would soon receive a manila envelope delivered to her table by a stranger. Inside would be photos of her opening the safe, a copy of the decoy documents, and a single sheet of paper that read, "Now you know what I really wanted to see." Why did I do it? Because for 30 years, I had played the role of the obedient daughter. The fixer, the one who paid her rent when she spent too much on designer handbags, the one who lent her car, paid her bills, and never questioned the stories. But success gives you clarity and power. I didn't need revenge. I needed freedom, and watching her take what she thought was everything gave me just that. Now, let me ask you something. If you knew someone close to you would betray you for money, would you still test them, or would you walk away? Tell me in the comments. I want to know your take on this kind of betrayal. And if you're loving these stories of power, lessons, and unexpected revenge, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more. You never know who's next to get exposed. I didn't hear from her again for 6 days, and honestly, I didn't expect to. In fact, part of me hoped I wouldn't. There was something deeply freeing about that silence. No guilt-tripping texts, no calls pretending to check on me but loaded with backhanded comments. For the first time in years, I could hear myself think, and what I thought was this: I had finally broken the cycle. Growing up, Denise made me believe everything I had was borrowed. My time, my space, my voice. She liked to keep me small. When I earned a scholarship, she said, "Well, don't go thinking you're better than the rest of us." When I got my first tech internship, she laughed and said, "So now you fix printers for a living." It wasn't just disapproval, it was sabotage disguised as concern. And even when I moved out and stopped asking for anything, she still found ways to make herself the center of every story. Including mine, but this time the story was mine, and I had rewritten the ending. On the 7th morning, she finally called again. This time, no fake cheer. "Elena," she said, her voice low and anxious, "I need to talk to you now." I paused, then answered, "Talk?" I didn't mean to take the case," she began, fumbling over her words. I panicked. "You shouldn't have left something like that in my house. You know I just—" "You what?" I asked calmly. "You just what, Mom?" "Opened the safe in the middle of the night and ran to another country because you were worried I'd come back for it." Silence. "You think I don't know where you are?" I added. "You think I didn't plan for this?" "Elena," she whispered, "why would you do this to me?" I let that question hang in the air like fog, because it was always about her, wasn't it? Her needs, her image, her feelings. She wasn't sorry she took the case. She was sorry she got caught, and that it didn't have what she wanted. "I didn't do this to you," I replied. "I did this because of you. You taught me how the world works. You taught me not to trust blindly. You taught me that even blood comes with fine print. So consider this a lesson you helped write." She started to cry softly at first. "I don't have anything anymore," she said. "I left everything behind, I thought. I thought there would be enough for me to start over. There never was anything to start with," I replied, and that was the truth. The black case held maybe a few $1,000s in decoy bills, and a legal agreement outlining the irrevocable trust I had already created for myself. Ironically, she took a distraction and lost everything. After that call, I knew the chapter with her was closing. I wasn't angry. I was relieved. I had needed to see with undeniable clarity what she valued more, our relationship or the idea of cashing in on it. The next week, I hosted a private investor dinner in Manhattan to pitch a new project, something I had been dreaming of, a mentorship and funding program for underrepresented founders. I had an entire suite of donors lined up, and the gallery was buzzing with potential. Halfway through the evening, as I sipped wine and discussed pitch rounds, one of my staff handed me a note. "She's outside." It read. I knew exactly who she was. I excused myself, stepped into the lobby, and saw her Denise, standing outside in a worn blazer, clutching her purse like a lifeline. Her eyes darted across the room, scanning for an opening. I stepped out, closing the door behind me. "Mom," I said flatly. "You made your point," she said, her voice cracking. "I lost everything. Can you please just let me talk to you?" I stood there for a long moment, the winter breeze brushing past me. For the first time, I didn't feel that old familiar guilt creeping in. I didn't feel the need to fix things or soften the moment. I felt whole. "I did let you talk," I replied back then. "Every time you cut me down, dismissed my work, or laughed at my plans, I let you talk. But now I'm finally the one talking." She stared at me, her eyes pleading. "Elena, please, you can't just cut me out." I nodded. "I didn't, you did." And I walked back inside, leaving the past where it belonged, outside and behind glass. That moment didn't feel triumphant. It felt necessary, like closing a door that had been creaking for too long. I wasn't trying to punish her. I was protecting myself, my peace, my future. Inside, my lead investor raised a glass in my direction and smiled. "To second chapters," he said. I smiled back, knowing mine was already underway. Later that week, I found myself sitting in a quiet cafe, staring out the window at the rain streaking down the glass. It had become my new routine, a place to reflect between meetings, pitches, and the whirlwind that now was my life. I had come so far, and yet the shadows of what had happened still danced in the periphery of my thoughts. Denise's letter lingered in the drawer of my office, unopened since that day, but never out of mind. Her legal stunt was just another page in the book of her manipulations, but it no longer hurt the way it used to. Now it only fueled me. Across from me, a familiar face appeared. Clara, my mentor from years ago, and one of the few people who'd ever encouraged me without condition. She sipped her coffee and smiled. "You've become a force, Elena, not just a success story, but a lighthouse for others." I smiled but said nothing. I hadn't told her about the claim Denise filed. I hadn't told anyone beyond my legal team. I didn't want to dim the light by dragging in the storm, but Clara, perceptive as always, saw through my silence. "She tried to take more than money from you, didn't she?" I nodded slowly. "She tried to take credit, ownership, my narrative." "And did she succeed?" Clara asked. I shook my head. "No, not this time. You know," Clara said thoughtfully, "sometimes when people see you climbing, they throw stones not to stop you, but because they're afraid you'll get to the top without needing them." That truth settled deep in my bones. Denise had always operated from a place of fear. Her control came not from strength, but from a terror of being left behind. And now that I had outgrown her approval, she had nothing left to wield. After parting ways with Clara, I returned to the office, where my assistant informed me of an unexpected visit. A woman from one of our scholarship partner schools had arrived with a letter and a bouquet of wildflowers, handpicked, she said, from a garden the girls planted in my name. "They wanted to thank you," she explained, her eyes misty, "because someone like you made them believe that their stories don't have to end where they started." I accepted the flowers and opened the envelope later that evening. Inside was a collection of handwritten notes from girls as young as 14 and as old as 21. They spoke of trauma, of dreams, of rebuilding confidence, of daring to dream again. One wrote, "You didn't know my name, but you saved my life." I wept. Not out of grief, but out of release, because that was it. That was the moment I finally understood. All this time, I had been trying to prove my worth to someone incapable of seeing it. And in the process, I had unknowingly become a beacon for others who desperately needed to believe in themselves. It wasn't just business anymore. It was a revolution of identity. That same week, my company was nominated for a Global Innovation Award. It wasn't just for technology, it was for community impact. I was invited to speak at a major summit in Geneva, and in my speech I didn't talk about Denise or her betrayal. I talked about legacy, about healing. About how sometimes the ones who hurt us most prepare us to lead the ones who need us most. The applause thundered through the hall, and for the first time I felt something better than pride. I felt peace. Back home, Denise's claim was officially thrown out of court. My lawyer sent me the formal dismissal papers, and I didn't even open them for 2 days. When I finally did, I glanced at them once, then folded them into the same drawer that held her letter. 2 things, 1 drawer, my past and my choice to move beyond it. On a Saturday morning, I returned to the mentorship center. The walls were now covered with framed photos from the last 2 years. Launches, graduations, ribbon cuttings. One photo stopped me in my tracks. It was of me mid-laugh, arms around 2 young founders who had just secured funding. I didn't recognize myself at first because I looked happy, not triumphant, not guarded. Just happy. That's when I realized I had rewritten my story, not in defiance of my mother, but in celebration of who I became without her shadow over me. And maybe, just maybe, Denise had finally taught me something after all. How not to live, how not to love, how not to lead. And for that, in the strangest way, I was grateful. The rain had stopped by the time I stepped out of the hotel lobby, but the tension pressing against my chest hadn't lifted. Every minute that passed added another layer to the mystery that had unraveled my life in the span of 48 hours. My mother was gone, $10 million had vanished with her, and now I had to untangle the final knot that had bound me to her for years, the reason she did it. But I wasn't just chasing answers. I was executing a plan she had unknowingly helped set in motion. Back at my apartment, I sat on the floor of my home office with the contents of the remaining safe deposit bags spread out before me. Envelopes, keys, an encrypted USB, and then, tucked inside a leather-bound ledger, a sealed letter with my name handwritten in her delicate, looping script. To Jordan, if you're reading this, you already know. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal. The letter was both confession and justification. She had taken the decoy bait. The 10 million wasn't what it seemed. In truth, it was seeded with traceable security mechanisms and a clever algorithm that automatically flagged and reported movement above certain thresholds. I had designed it to test her, yes, but also to protect what was really mine. My true fortune, the patents, the offshore accounts, and the intellectual property behind my cybersecurity empire, was never in that money. That sum was the flashy bait. She had chosen to steal it, and in doing so, revealed herself entirely. She wrote about regret, about feeling small when she looked at me and saw someone who had risen without her. She confessed to being threatened by my success, fearful that if I no longer needed her approval, I wouldn't need her at all. So she took the money to remind me who had raised me, who had sacrificed. But even in the letter, it wasn't guilt that permeated her words. It was entitlement. As if, despite everything, she still believed she deserved it. I should have been devastated, but instead I felt oddly free. That letter confirmed what I'd suspected all along. She hadn't changed, she never would, and now, for the first time, I didn't need her validation. She had taken the bait, but she had no idea what was coming next. The next day, I was scheduled to speak at a global cybersecurity conference in New York. Headlining alongside me was someone my mother used to compare me to relentlessly, Charles Hanley, her old friend's son. She had followed his rise in the tech world obsessively, using him as a benchmark for my supposed underperformance throughout my teenage years. But now we were peers, equals, or at least she thought we were. What she didn't know, and what Charles didn't yet know either, was that my firm had just acquired his entire company through a silent merger finalized weeks ago. I had intentionally kept the announcement under wraps until this very moment. When I took the stage, I spoke not just about innovation, but about legacy, about trust, about betrayal. My speech was laced with personal experience, wrapped in metaphors, but each word was targeted. I knew she would be watching, wherever she was, and I wanted her to hear every word. Midway through my talk, I pivoted into the acquisition announcement. A live feed broadcasted the breaking news banner across every screen in the auditorium. Cyber Sentry acquires Hanley Tech in $400 deal. The room erupted. Cameras flashed. Charles caught off guard, blinked in disbelief from his seat in the front row. And then I said it. Sometimes the people closest to us underestimate our vision. They try to take from us what they think is valuable, money, recognition, status, but they overlook the thing that can't be stolen, our capacity to build again, to lead, to evolve. After my speech, I stepped down from the stage into a blur of handshakes and congratulations. But one message on my phone stood out, a notification from the International Fraud Division I had been coordinating with. They had located my mother's withdrawal activity. She had attempted to wire the money through a shell account in Zurich, but the transfer had been flagged and frozen. She was in custody. Part of me had expected this moment to be exhilarating. But when I saw her sitting behind the glass at the Swiss holding facility during a secure video call, she didn't look like the powerful, calculating woman I had feared for years. She looked tired, not old, but exhausted. Her eyes searched my face for something, anger, pain, perhaps a trace of affection, but I didn't give her the satisfaction. You knew, she said finally, you knew what I would do. I nodded. I hoped I was wrong, but I couldn't afford to be. Her lip quivered. It wasn't supposed to go like this. You mean I wasn't supposed to outsmart you? I said calmly. Or that the son you underestimated planned for this outcome better than you could have imagined. I needed that money, Jordan. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. I interrupted. You wanted control, you always have, but this time I took it back. She tried to lean forward, but the guard behind her barked a warning. You set me up, she hissed. I protected myself. I said. Something you never taught me to do because I always thought you'd protect me, but now I know better. There was silence on the line. She wiped her face and looked away. What happens now? That's not up to me, I said. That's up to the authorities, but I've dropped the civil suit. I just wanted the truth, and now I have it. Before she could speak again, I ended the call. I sat in silence for several minutes, the hum of the server room beside me filling the space like static. That was the final conversation I would ever have with my mother, and as strange as it sounds, it brought me peace. In the days that followed, I was invited to speak on multiple news outlets, not about the money, but about resilience. About protecting intellectual assets from betrayal, even from those closest to you. I didn't name names, I didn't need to. My story wasn't about revenge and amour. It was about clarity. A week later, I returned to the same family estate where this entire saga had begun. The same dining room where she used to host grand dinners, subtly shaming me in front of extended relatives for being too sensitive, too ambitious, too different. But now I stood at the head of the table, hosting the new trustees of the foundation I had launched in my mother's name, but not in her honor. It was a program supporting young innovators whose families had tried to stifle their dreams. The irony wasn't lost on me. As the meeting wrapped up, one of the trustees, a woman about my mother's age, leaned over and whispered, "You really turned this pain into something powerful." I nodded slowly, letting the weight of it settle. That was always the plan. I stared at the empty safe for a long time, long enough that my legs went numb crouching on the carpet. My hand was still gripping the metal handle, as if hoping that some hidden catch would reveal a false bottom, a second compartment, some secret chamber that proved I was dreaming. But there was no such twist. The safe was empty. My mother had taken the money and disappeared overnight, just as I had feared, just as I had predicted. And yet, strangely, as the hollow steel box mocked me with its silence, I began to smile. The events of the past week had felt like a slow march toward this moment. Ever since I'd placed the money inside the safe in her house, there had been this growing weight in my chest. Not anxiety exactly, more like confirmation waiting to settle. I had known she would take it, knew it in my bones the way you know the sun will rise. But I had hoped, just once, that maybe I was wrong. That maybe she wouldn't betray me. That maybe she'd prove she had changed. But she hadn't, and yet, I laughed, because what she took wasn't the money at all. By the time I stood up, the smirk had settled into something like peace. I locked the empty safe out of habit and moved back into the main room of the house. The sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows like it always had, illuminating the dust particles floating in the air. It was quieterly quiet. No morning news blaring from the television, no faint smell of coffee, no clatter of dishes. Just silence, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for my reaction. But I didn't scream or cry or call the police. I simply pulled out my phone and opened the secure app I'd coded myself. The tracker was still active, of course it was. The briefcase that held the cash also held a tiny device inside a fake buckle on the side. A GPS chip with encrypted, satellite-reliant feedback. It had been transmitting its coordinates every 30 seconds since I'd left it in the safe. I hadn't told anyone about it, not even Jessica, not even Marcus, because if there was anything life had taught me, it was that you don't tell the fox where the henhouse is. You just let it think it's one, and then close the gate. I watched as the red blinking dot pinged across the screen. It was moving. Already 3 states away. Good. Let her run. I sat down at the kitchen table, pulled out a protein bar, and ate while tracking her on the screen. I had everything I needed. Her flight route, her current direction, even the motel she had stopped at the night before. My fingers tapped the table rhythmically, almost like music, while my brain calculated possibilities. What she didn't know, what made me laugh that morning, was that the cash she had taken was a test, a bait. Most of it was real, yes. I wasn't careless enough to fake the entire stack, but inside that briefcase were documents. Evidence, photos, a copy of the secret property she had illegally transferred into her name a year ago, one that I had quietly bought back through a third party and placed under my new LLC. A full confession typed in her handwriting from an old journal I'd found buried in boxes in the attic. The kind of proof that would, if ever made public, ruin her entire reputation. And it was all sitting in that briefcase she had so gleefully stolen. She thought she had taken my future. In reality, she had just picked up the weight of her own past. Marcus called an hour later. "She's gone, isn't she?" "Yeah," I said calmly, watching the red dot pull into a gas station in Missouri. "She took the bait." He whistled softly. "You okay?" "I will be," I said honestly. This was always going to happen. At least now it's on my terms. Jessica joined the call a minute later, her voice edged with concern. "What's the plan?" "We let her run," I said. "I give her just enough time to feel safe. Then we hit her with the real message." There was silence on the other end, the weight of what I was proposing sinking in. "You're actually going to do it?" Marcus asked. "I have to," I replied. "She made her choices, now she has to live with the consequences." After the call, I spent the rest of the day preparing. I backed up the GPS data. I made copies of the documents in my cloud storage. I even contacted a private investigator, not to track her, but to ensure she remained safe. I didn't want revenge in the dramatic, cruel sense. I just wanted accountability, and I wanted peace, and that meant making sure she didn't spiral into something worse. Because for all the pain she'd caused, she was still my mother, but she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. 2 days later, the signal stopped moving. She had checked into a long-term rental under a false name. I waited one more day, then made the call. She picked up on the third ring. "You really thought I wouldn't know?" I asked calmly. Silence. "You really thought I'd leave $10 million unprotected? That I'd put it in your safe with no backup?" Still silence. "You didn't take my money," I continued. "You took your own undoing." Her voice cracked then. "Why did you do this?" "Because I needed to know," I said. "I needed to know if you'd choose greed again, and you did, you always do." "I'm your mother." "No," I said gently. "You're the woman who gave birth to me. But a mother doesn't do what you did. Not over and over. Not when she knows the damage it causes." She started crying, but I didn't flinch. "I won't press charges," I told her. "But I have the proof, everything you've tried to bury. I have it all. So from now on, you live your life quietly. You don't come near my business, or my family, or my name. You don't try to use me again, or that case won't just be a missing bag. It'll be an exhibit in court." Her sobs grew louder, but I ended the call before they could manipulate me again. The following week, I hosted my first Art Tech Gala, an event months in the making. Investors showed up. So did Jessica and Marcus. We toasted to a future free from the chains of family betrayal. And as I stood on the stage, thanking the people who helped me become who I was, I realized I wasn't just healing. I was building something new. Something honest. My mother's betrayal had hurt, but it had also freed me. Because when someone finally shows you who they are, the greatest peace is in believing them, and then walking away, for good. The late morning sun filtered through the blinds of my office as I sat across from Detective Morgan, sipping the now cold espresso I'd made an hour ago. She was calm but focused, her pen tapping lightly against her notepad. "You're sure she didn't know the safe had been switched?" she asked. I nodded, lips tightening. "Positive. That safe was a decoy. The real one was buried under reinforced flooring behind biometric protection. Only I could access it." The weight of the last 48 hours pressed against my chest like lead, but I refused to let it show. My mother had stolen something, but not what she thought. After she vanished that night, I stayed up reviewing the footage from the hidden cameras I'd placed around the house weeks prior. What I watched was a version of her I hadn't fully accepted until now. Methodical, silent, ruthless. She moved like a woman who'd done this before. Her gloves left no prints, and her burner phone pinged off 5 towers before disappearing off the grid. My mother, the woman who once struggled to organize her sock drawer, had orchestrated a heist like a professional, but she had taken the wrong safe, the one I had rigged with mock bills and an envelope that read, "If you're reading this, you've already lost." That morning the media buzzed with vague reports of a financial whistleblower vanishing after securing what many assumed was a multi-million-dollar payout. No one mentioned me by name. I'd planned it that way. The real money was still untouched, earning interest, locked in an offshore account under a trust tied to a charity shell. Every legal stone had been turned before this moment. My mother might have taken a fake 10 million in cash, but she had actually walked away with something far more volatile: her own exposure. 2 hours later, I was boarding a jet to Zurich, where the next phase of my plan would unfold. The pilot nodded respectfully as I entered the private cabin. "Good to see you again, MS. Kinsley." I offered a polite smile and buckled in. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to breathe. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't spite. It was control. Something I hadn't had in my relationship with my mother since I was a child. And now, I wasn't a pawn in her game anymore. Once we landed, I was escorted to the law office of Gruber and Weiss, a firm known for two things: discretion and power. My lawyer, Madeline, was already waiting in a sleek gray conference room. "It's done," she said before I even sat down. "The transfer is complete, and the press release is queued for your approval." I reviewed the final draft on her tablet. The headline was bold: "Anonymous investor donates $10 million to abuse recovery fund under mother's name." My chest tightened at the irony. "You're still naming her?" Madeline asked, eyeing me carefully. I nodded. "That's the only way to keep her from surfacing. If she shows up to claim any part of this, the media will dig, and then the truth comes out." The fund would operate without her knowledge, under her name, helping the very kinds of people she used to dismiss as weak. It was poetic justice wrapped in philanthropy, and it cost me nothing, because the real money was never about currency. It was about rewriting the story she tried to script for me. Back home, the firestorm was just beginning. My mother's absence had triggered confusion, concern, and eventually, investigation. Her accounts were being flagged for suspicious activity, and several family members reached out, wondering if I knew anything. I kept my responses vague. "We haven't spoken in years," I wrote in one message. Technically true, not since I discovered her attempt to sell off my startup's patent behind my back last year. That betrayal was the final straw. The moment I knew I had to distance myself, not just physically, but financially, emotionally, strategically. As Zurich faded in the distance behind me, I returned to the U.S. with a new sense of clarity. The next time I saw her would be on my terms, and that moment came far sooner than I expected. 3 weeks after her disappearance, she resurfaced. Flustered, angry, broke. She hadn't read the note inside the decoy safe until she was already on the run. When she did, she realized too late that the bills were marked and useless. Her panic led her to a cheap motel in Reno, where she was eventually caught trying to offload fake currency to a stranger who turned out to be an undercover agent. The arrest made local news. Her mugshot didn't even resemble the woman I once knew. Gone was the perfectly curled hair, the expensive jewelry. In its place was a hollow, doubt version of a woman who had spent her life climbing ladders she never built. When the trial came, I didn't attend out of hatred. I went for closure. She refused to look at me as she was led into the courtroom, hands bound, the room buzzing with curiosity. I sat in the front row, wearing a navy blue suit and the diamond pendant she once told me I wasn't mature enough to inherit. The proceedings were quick. The judge read out charges related to theft, fraud, and the distribution of counterfeit currency. Her lawyer tried to argue diminished responsibility, citing stress and manipulation, but the evidence was clear. And when the verdict was read, I saw the moment her composure cracked. Afterward, I waited outside as the press crowded around the courthouse steps. They were hoping for a soundbite. Instead, I handed out a prepared statement. My family's struggles are personal. It began, but I believe in accountability and in using pain to create purpose. No further questions. I stepped into the waiting car and drove away, knowing this was the last chapter in a long and painful story. The world could spin its version of events, but I knew the truth. Back in my new apartment, a sleek space overlooking the skyline, I poured a glass of wine and stared out over the city. The safe, the schemes, the stolen years, they were behind me now. In their place was a life I built, brick by brick, without shortcuts. I opened my laptop and checked on the fund. Donations had tripled since the press release. Survivors were already sharing testimonials, thanking MS Delaney for the impact. She would never know the good she'd accidentally done, but I did, and that was enough. That night, as I closed my eyes, I wasn't haunted by her betrayal. I was comforted by my own evolution. I had faced the storm, walked through it, and emerged with something no one could steal: peace. The days following the courtroom verdict felt oddly still, not quiet in the literal sense. The world still buzzed, emails flowed, meetings lined my calendar, but internally there was a kind of silence I hadn't known before. The kind that arrives after a year's long storm finally passes, and all that's left is the echo of your own breath. I found myself staring at windows a lot, watching birds flit between power lines, watching the clouds slide overhead like a slow reel of time. For the first time in years, I wasn't planning revenge, guarding my next step, or decoding my mother's latest manipulation. I was just existing, untouched, intact, and finally free. The fund in her name, the one I had legally set up with the diverted money, was thriving. Not just financially. It was making headlines for its outreach and results. Survivors of financial abuse were getting counseling, job training, and in some cases, housing. We launched a scholarship arm for women escaping coercive households, and within a month, we had more applicants than we'd expected for the year. Every success story that filtered into my inbox was a balm against the scar my mother had left. I didn't just rewrite the narrative, I flipped it. I made her name mean something better than what she'd ever allowed it to stand for. Still, not everything felt like closure. Closure isn't a perfectly tied bow. It's a slow mending, like threads pulling back together one by one. My aunt, her older sister, reached out a week after the trial. She hadn't spoken to my mother in years, some falling out over an inheritance that predated even my birth, but she said she'd seen the news. "I just want you to know," her message said, "what your mother did was never your fault. Some people break everything they touch, but you're not one of them. You built something, hold on to that." I stared at that message for a long time before replying with just 2 words: "Thank you." Meanwhile, my legal team was wrapping up the final matters of her conviction. She'd accepted a plea deal in exchange for partial restitution and a reduced sentence. It would still mean several years behind bars, but the press had already turned their gaze elsewhere. Public outrage is a fickle thing. Hot and furious one week, forgotten the next. I preferred it that way. Let her fade into obscurity. Let the world remember the fund and not the mess that created it. One evening, a thick manila envelope arrived at my office, delivered by a courier who offered no return address. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was hers. My heart ticked a little faster as I opened it, pulling out several folded pages and a photograph tucked into the middle. The letter was scrawled in uneven lines, not angry or blaming, but tired. She didn't apologize, not really. What she did was recount memories, our old apartment, the time I made her laugh by putting shampoo in her coffee mug, how I used to sing while brushing my teeth. "You were always brighter than I let you be." One sentence read, "I knew it. I just couldn't stand the way you shined without me." That line cut deeper than any accusation. The photo was from when I was about 8, me sitting on the kitchen counter, feet swinging, while she stirred something on the stove. We both looked happy, or maybe just unaware. I kept the photo not out of sentimentality, but as proof that even the worst stories have chapters that don't match the rest. I didn't write back. Instead, I doubled down on the good I could do. I spoke at 2 panels on financial abuse and how it hides in plain sight. I consulted with nonprofits on structuring legacy grants, and I met a woman, Elena, who ran a grassroots organization focused on rebuilding family systems after economic betrayal. She had a kind of calm that wasn't rehearsed. the kind that came from surviving something terrible and choosing not to be defined by it. We had coffee one afternoon that turned into dinner, and then a weekend walk by the lake where she asked, "Do you ever feel like it's still not real? Like one day you'll wake up and she'll be standing in the doorway again, holding the strings?" I smiled softly. Sometimes, but then I remember, I'm the one holding the scissors now. As our relationship deepened, so did my understanding of healing. It wasn't about getting even. It was about living well, living fully. My apartment, once stark and clinical, began to fill with color again. I painted a wall in the living room a deep emerald. I bought books I didn't need. I started cooking. I didn't even like cooking, but the act of feeding myself something warm and intentional was a kind of rebellion against years of being fed cold dismissals. Eventually, I visited the correctional facility where my mother was being held. Not to see her, but to speak to a group of women enrolled in a rehabilitation program. Many had been part of scams or financial rings. Many had been manipulated by family, lovers, or partners. I told them my story, not with bitterness, but with the kind of clarity that comes from living on the other side. When I finished, one woman raised her hand and said, "So you forgave her?" I paused, then answered honestly, "I don't know if forgiveness is the right word, but I stopped letting her decide how I feel, and maybe that's better." That night, I walked past the visitor wing. I didn't stop. I didn't even glance. I just kept walking, past the clanking gates and the searching eyes. I had nothing left to give her, and I didn't need anything from her. I had become someone stronger, not because of what she did, but in spite of it. Months passed, seasons shifted, and one morning I received a call from the foundation's new director. She told me that the fund in my mother's name had hit its goal 5 years early. "We're expanding to 3 more countries," she said excitedly. "Your mother's name is now synonymous with recovery and resilience." I didn't correct her. Let the world have that version. Let the name do good, even if the woman behind it never did. Later that evening, I lit a single candle by my window, not for mourning, but for marking a chapter closed. The city lights blinked beneath me, endless and bright. My story wasn't defined by what had been taken, but by what I'd built and what I had chosen to protect, myself. There's something surreal about watching your world transform from one rooted in defense to one defined by direction. Before the courtroom, the confession, the exposure, my days were built like armor, layered in suspicion, alertness, strategy. Now they unfolded more like a blueprint. There was clarity in my calendar, peace in my apartment, and most surprisingly, hope in my conversations. The chaos my mother left behind hadn't shattered me. It had sharpened me. It took time to fully acknowledge just how much she had taken, not in dollars or assets, but in the small and sacred things. Moments of pride she had soured, relationships she had poisoned, truths she had bent until I doubted them myself. But now, as each day passed without the lingering fog of her presence, I found those small things returning like birds after a storm. I started laughing without checking who was listening. I shared stories without filtering their weight. And I made decisions that weren't motivated by spite, but by vision. The $10 million I had hidden, disguised, protected. It had never been about money. It had been a test of loyalty, of curiosity, of greed. She failed it completely, and yet that failure revealed more than her betrayal. It revealed who I was capable of becoming when I let go of what I was trying to save. After the verdict and her sentence were made public, the response was divided. Some family members messaged me privately, either stunned or pretending to be. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years wrote, "I always wondered how you stayed so composed. Now I get it." But others, particularly her friends and a few distant relatives, accused me of betrayal. They called it cruel, extreme. "She's your mother." One aunt wrote, "She made mistakes, but blood is blood." I didn't respond to any of them, because if blood demands silence in the face of abuse, then it's not loyalty, it's a leash. I channeled those emotions into something constructive. The foundation I'd started grew rapidly. What began as a local support hub became a national movement. We launched digital education tools for teens, teaching financial independence and how to recognize subtle manipulation. How help can become control, how love can come with ledgers. We hosted workshops with survivors, therapists, and even former financial abusers willing to share what fueled their behaviors. It was raw, uncomfortable, and sometimes controversial, but it was real. That was the point. Meanwhile, the media began to shift their narrative. Initially, I had been the tech entrepreneur whose mother stole millions. But gradually, stories focused less on the scandal and more on the solutions. I started getting invitations to speak at conferences on resilience, ethics, even art, oddly enough. One such event took place in Paris, hosted by a global innovation group. After my talk, a soft-spoken man approached me and said, "What you built out of betrayal, that's more than success, that's alchemy." I wasn't sure how to respond, but I smiled and thanked him. I knew what he meant. It was during that same trip to Paris that I finally let myself grieve the mother I'd never had. Not the woman who raised me, but the one I used to imagine. The one who would cheer me on, protect me, show up. I visited a quiet cafe, pulled out an old journal, and wrote her a letter I'd never send. "You were right about one thing." I wrote, "You said I was too independent, too proud, too guarded. You helped make me that way. But you also underestimated what those qualities could become in the right hands. I may have inherited your instincts, but I never inherited your hunger for control. I used mine to protect, not to possess." The journey home from Paris felt different. I wasn't just returning from a trip. I was returning from a transformation. I stepped off the plane lighter, like I had finally placed the emotional luggage down for good. When I got home, I unpacked not just clothes, but peace. I redecorated the guest room. I called friends just to hear their voices. I picked up painting again, a hobby I'd abandoned in my 20s when I couldn't afford supplies and Mom said it was a waste of time. Now, I painted as a kind of freedom, color without consequence. The final stage of Mom's sentence was the parole hearing. I didn't attend. I didn't object either. I left it to the legal team and the system. I wasn't interested in her punishment anymore. What mattered was that she was no longer a part of my life's architecture. She could get out, move across the world, change her name. I wouldn't follow. I had already walked away. One afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail. No return address. Just a single page inside. "I still don't understand why you did it." It read, "But I see what you've done with it. And I suppose that says more than anything I could ever write. Goodbye." There was no signature, but I didn't need one. That was the last I heard from her. And strangely, it didn't sting, it felt final, not tragic. Just done with that chapter behind me. I leaned harder into the future. I launched a new project, a startup accelerator for underrepresented founders. Not just a fund, but a full mentorship and equity sharing model. We targeted single mothers, survivors of financial abuse, and people rebuilding after estrangement. I wasn't just passing the ladder down. I was building new ones beside the cliffs most people fall off alone. Elena, the woman I'd met months ago, became more than a partner in advocacy. She became my partner in life. We took things slow, carefully, like people who know how sharp broken trust can be. But eventually, we shared a home, a vision, and on one very quiet winter morning, a promise. Not the flashy kind, not even a legal one yet, but a whispered agreement to show up every day, honestly, even when it's hard. We don't talk about my mother often, but sometimes when I'm telling a story from childhood or explaining a scar only I can see, Elena reaches across the table and simply says, "And still look at you now." It's not pity, it's pride, the kind I never got to hear from my own mother, but the kind I now believe in because I earned it myself. Eventually, I was invited to an awards ceremony recognizing philanthropic impact in crisis recovery. I wasn't going to attend, but the team insisted. When my name was called and I walked onto the stage, I didn't think about the courtroom or the betrayal. I thought about that safe, that dark metal box where I once placed $10 million as a test. I thought about how she took it, ran with it, and how I still came out richer. I stepped up to the podium and looked out at the crowd. "We all have safes," I said. "Not just the ones made of steel. but the ones in our hearts. We store our hopes there, our trust, our plans, and sometimes people we love break them open. But we are not what was stolen. We are what we choose to rebuild. The applause was thunderous. But what mattered more was the silence that followed, just for a moment. The stillness of people feeling it. That was everything. And as I left the stage that night, Elena waiting at the side with her warm smile and quiet eyes, I felt no trace of what I used to carry. No resentment, no rage, just resolution, not revenge, not victory, just peace. In the quiet that followed everything, after the investigation closed, after the interviews ended, and after my mother disappeared from both my life and the headlines, I sat with one burning question. What was the real cost of trust, and how do you rebuild it when it's been shattered by the very person who taught you to define it? The money was never the real story. It could have been $1,000 or 10 million. The number didn't matter. It was what it represented, vulnerability. To trust someone with access to your world, to your secrets, to your future, is to offer them a piece of you they didn't earn just through love, but through faith. And my mother had taken that and traded it for power, control, ego. But the irony was, when she opened that safe, she didn't just steal from me. She freed me. Growing up, I was conditioned to think of my mother as the center of stability, but over time, that stability came at a cost. Every decision passed through her filter, every success was rebranded as hers, and every boundary I tried to set was seen as rebellion. When I placed that money in her safe, it wasn't just to test her morals. It was to test my readiness, to see if I was finally strong enough to face the answer I'd feared my whole life. That love doesn't excuse betrayal. And when she failed that test, when she took the money and disappeared, I didn't collapse. I didn't spiral, I evolved. It taught me that sometimes the people who break you aren't strangers or enemies, they're family, and that betrayal from someone you love is a scar that never fully fades, but it does stop bleeding. What you do with that scar determines the kind of person you become. Some people carry it like armor, constantly on the defense. Others turn it into wisdom, and from that wisdom, they build stronger lives, wiser relationships, and deeper compassion. I chose the second path. I used the pain as blueprint. I used the betrayal as a mirror, not to reflect how wrong she was, but to remind myself how right I could become if I stayed grounded in truth. I didn't just survive her leaving. I redefined what survival looked like. It wasn't just about bouncing back. It was about building forward. People often think closure comes from confrontation, from screaming matches or courtroom verdicts. But closure is much quieter than that. It's a choice you make in solitude. It's when you stop waiting for an apology and realize you don't need one to move on. It's when you choose to grow without needing the person who hurt you to witness it. My life now is not defined by what she took, but by what I reclaimed, my agency, my peace, my clarity. If there's one lesson I want people to take from this story, it's that betrayal is not the end of your narrative, it's the turning point. It's where the plot thickens and your character deepens. You discover strength you didn't know you had. You learn to trust yourself more than you trust the people who told you they'd never hurt you. You stop looking for justice in others and start creating it for yourself. And maybe most importantly, you learn the difference between forgiveness and permission. Forgiving someone doesn't mean you let them back in. It means you free yourself from the chain of resentment. You stop carrying the weight of their choices and start carrying the weight of your own healing. Some might say I was lucky to have the resources, the intelligence, the support system. And yes, I had those, but those weren't what saved me. What saved me was choosing not to become like her, choosing not to meet betrayal with vengeance or pain with poison. What saved me was choosing integrity again and again, even when it hurt. The truth is, we all have a safe, a place where we store the things that matter most, our dignity, our purpose, our dreams, and yes, sometimes the people closest to us try to break into it. But the real power, it's realizing you can rebuild what was taken. You can change the locks. You can decide who gets access from this moment forward. I don't miss my mother, not the real one, not the one who ran with the money. But I still carry love for the version of her I imagined growing up, the one who cheered at my recitals, who baked cakes on my birthdays, who wanted me to fly without trying to clip my wings. That mother may not have existed, but she inspired me to become someone better than the one who raised me. In the end, I didn't need to chase her down or prove my worth. I just needed to trust that walking away wasn't weakness. It was wisdom, that silence sometimes is louder than confrontation, and that healing is the quietest, yet most defiant kind of revenge. Because here I am, free, whole, and proud, not despite what she did, but because I chose to rise above it.